So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about Kubernetes, user access management for large enterprises. We've already been introduced. Dimitrij Klesev from WhizUs is supporting us at ÖBB. With our tons of Kubernetes clusters, we are working every day. So maybe a question at the beginning, who knows some parts of Kubernetes, who has already worked with Kubernetes in here?
Plenty of.
So quite a lot of people, okay? Perfect. Let's start. When we set up a Kubernetes cluster, what is it, what we usually do? We usually use the kubeadm command and say kubeadm init, the cluster gets configured, and what we get afterwards is this admin conf. The admin conf already holds a client certificate that enables us to communicate with the Kubernetes cluster. And what we are doing usually is taking this admin conf and copy it over to some place, usually a home directory on our laptop or desktop PC where we are working on usually. But what's the problem with this? It is feasible for 1 cluster, 5 clusters, maybe 10 clusters. But what's going to happen if you have more than 5, 10, 20 clusters? Like we at the ÖBB, we have dev clusters, we have prod clusters, we have lab clusters, GPU clusters, hybrid clusters, even Windows clusters. We have Kubernetes clusters in the cloud. So copying over the admin conf for every cluster here might be painful and error prone. So if you look at our company, what will you usually find when it comes to Kubernetes? You will have a project, you have devs, you have ops, maybe you have quality assurance. And if you look at the dev team, in our company, it's usually a Scrum team, and the sub-teams, like here team A and B, are different tribes working on different features of an application. That's just one project, but we don't have just one project. We have many projects. So how are you going to handle this? You have maybe a developer that works in project A and project C and has different permissions in these projects. So how are you going to handle this? So this has to be managed somehow. And this is where LDAP comes into play. LDAP reflects a company's hierarchy. If you have a look at our company, the ÖBB, we have a holding company. Below we have sub-companies like mine, the ÖBB Business Competence Center GmbH, or Rail Cargo maybe. And in a company you have different departments, and even in a department you have different teams. So this is usually held in a directory. A common one is Active Directory. You might find products like Red Hat Directory Server, just a plain LDAP directory somewhere. And when it comes to Kubernetes, in terms of authentication, not authorization, authentication, LDAP is not supported. So what are we going to do? We are using OpenID Connect in order to communicate. So how does OpenID Connect work? Philip already told us all the details. But in terms of Kubernetes, you have the user. The user logs into the identity provider. In our case, it's Keycloak. The identity provider delivers a token to the user. Then the user can use kubectl, the client, with this token in order to connect to the API server, and the Kubernetes API server checks, is the token valid, is it expired, and so on. And if it's okay, the API server says your authorization is okay, and allows kubectl to deliver back the desired result to the user. Just as a quick overview how this looks. And In our case, as I mentioned, we use Keycloak as an identity provider, and we use FreeEPA, a Red Hat product, as our directory service. This is just the authentication part now, and Dimi will show you how we do this in a quick demo.
So, let's go to the demo part. At first, we'll go to FreeEPA. So this is our directory service, right? Just log into FreeEPA. And after your login, the first time you will be presented with this screen. Just a plain vanilla setup. So we have only one user right now here, right? So let's, for example, add some users. And of course, a secure password. So now we have some users within our directory service, right? So now we are moving to our identity provider. So in this case, Keycloak. So let's log into Keycloak. So usually, the first time you will be presented with the master realm. It means if you first set up the identity provider, you don't have any configuration done yet, right? So, and the master realm is used to manage all the other realms you will create, for example, for different clusters, for different projects, and so on. So it's on your own how you separate it. And what we have to do is to connect Keycloak somehow to the to our directory service. So this can be done with user federation, which is provided out of the box within Keycloak. So we can select between Kerberos, LDAP, and you can integrate another provider like SSHD, if you like, if you have some more complex directory services setups and so on, like we have. Yeah, I did it already, so I prepared it. I created a demo realm, and I created the user federation configuration, how it looks like. So you have first to select some meta information like which directory service vendor you are using and so on, the synchronization modes and so on. And you have to provide, of course, the connection details and where to get the users from the path of your directory service. So if we test it like here, so we can connect to EPA, just now to connect, and we have to provide some credentials with which we are able to read or retrieve this information from, right? So if we test the authentication part, we can see we are done here. So if we save it, and if we look if we have already some users here, not yet. So if we go back to our user federation and synchronize all our users, you can see here 2 users are now imported within Keycloak. So if we go back to users, you can see here users are imported, and if we view the details of the user, we can see that the directory service, the federation link, is viewed or is set up within the user. So if we click onto the directory service or federation link, you can see here we land back within the configuration screen for directory service or user federation provider. Now we have our users within our identity provider. So from here on, we have to set up the Kubernetes part somehow, right? So for this, we have to create some clients because we would like to use OpenID Connect. So we need to create some clients. For the demo purposes, I created 2 clients. One we will use within the Kubernetes API server, and one we will need for our kubectl. here you have to ask your security expert how to register or create proper clients within your company setup. For this, let's see how to configure the API server. As you can notice here, I'm already configured, or my kubectl is already configured to use the admin conf, what you will get the first time you configure your Kubernetes cluster or you set it up. Let's look into nodes. So we have 2 nodes out there, one master node, one worker node. So, and let's look into the kube API server configuration. So the relevant part here are 3 options added to the default options you will usually get in your pod configuration or your pod YAML. The first one is we have to provide the client, which will be used to check your GBT tokens or your tokens to this client to be included within the audience. So if we will get an GBT token for our kubectl client, we have to somehow have any information provided within the GBT token that this token is also valid for Kubernetes at the audience. And we have to specify the identity provider, the issuer role of the tokens. Because we're using OpenID Connect, everything else is specified how to fetch credentials or like public keys or user information and so on. So Kube API server within some GBT libraries and so on will do the work for us. And the most important part, which we will need in the second part of the talk, is the special claim param or special claim option, the group claim. Here we have to provide from which claim we try to extract the groups, which we will need later for authorization to somehow decide, or API server to be able to map the permissions from identity provider to Kubernetes internal parameters or configuration. So here I'm already set up. Now I'm going to kubectl. If you look into kubectl, you can see here just the most default configuration where we have the cluster defined. So it's like the default admin conf. Now we have to add an additional context. So the context looks like the same, like the previous one. And you can see here the administrator certificate and private key to get cluster administrator permissions on the cluster. We have to add some special user with identity provider configuration for OpenID Connect, where we specify the name of the user, and now we have to provide a client ID, we have to provide a client secret, we have to provide an identity token, an IDP issuer URL, and a refresh token. Usually you only need a valid refresh token because kubectl is able to refresh your identity tokens by its own. So if your identity token expires and you have a valid refresh token, you don't have to manually paste it all over the time you work with kubectl. The question now is how to handle this, or how to get the identity token or the refresh token within our kubectl. So there are plenty different ways out there. You can just use curl to authenticate to your identity provider, or you can deploy some authentication apps and so on, and then copy paste your tokens into kubectl. So when the refresh token expires, you have to do the same work again. But out there, there's already a tool called kubelogin. So this one does nothing else than just connecting to OpenID Connect provider with credentials, client ID and client secret specified within the kubectl, and just update the kubectl configuration for us. So let's switch the context to the demo context. So now if I try to get some nodes, for example, I don't have a valid identity token, right? So let's get some identity token. Now I got a valid identity token, and as you can notice here, it's replaced, or it's placed by kubelogin. So if we inspect the identity token on job.io, for example, we can see here it's definitely issued to my user. I used to log in to identity provider. And we have a claim here, which is, until now, it's empty. So, but we will use it later. So now we are authenticated to our identity provider. Let's do some basic operations, for example. So let's do demo get SA, for example. And you can see here the user is forbidden, which is quite reasonable because we don't have any configuration done yet to specify how to decide which permissions does this user have, right? So, and this is the second part Ronald will tell you about.
What about authorization? Kubernetes supports different types of authorization. One is node, it's a specialty for kubelets. One is role-based access control. We have attribute-based access control, and we even have webhooks for letting external applications do your authorization stuff. The most common one is role-based access control, and this is the one we are going to use in our demo here. Before we can use this, I have to explain a concept called role bindings in Kubernetes. We have different things involved here. One is the subject. The subject can be the user, for example. We have API resources, Kubernetes API resources like pods, deployments, secrets, whatever resources exist. And then we have operations, what you want to do. List something, create something. And the combination of an operation and the API resource is called a role. In this role, for example, you can see reading and creating pods is possible if somebody has this role. And somebody, the subject, has to be connected to the role somehow. And this is what is done via a role binding. Cluster-wide, it's called cluster role binding. If it's just for a namespace, like here in our namespace test, it's called role binding. So here you can see you will have many roles, and in order to not get the stuff messed up, we need to use meaningful patterns somehow, a naming concept. And how are we going to manage authorization with role-based access control in a reasonable way? We have a look at LDAP again. When we have a look at the slide from before, we have a project, we have devs, ops in the project, we have different teams in this project. You can see, oops, sorry, it was an attack. This project can be mapped to what we already have in our Kubernetes cluster. We also have a project with different clusters, like a prod cluster, a development cluster, and in every cluster we have namespaces. And what we want to do is mapping our hierarchies we have in LDAP with the role-based access control concept here. So we thought about a pattern that makes sense and speaks for itself and is very easy to read. We put it into different parts, like the customer, the project, the cluster, prod, dev, QA, whatever, namespaces, some optional parts, and the role. And when we have a look at our company, somebody like me who is allowed to do everything in every Kubernetes cluster, this might look just like this. Cluster admin, because I'm allowed to do everything everywhere. And when we come to some external guy like Dimi, he maybe is just allowed to read something in our demo namespace of the dev cluster. That's how we organized it in our company. The Kubernetes counterpart is the role binding, and what we see here, Kubernetes has a predefined cluster role named view, and what we are doing here is just mapping this naming pattern we've already defined to our demo namespace. And Dimitrij is going to show you how we do this exactly.
So let's get to the second part, the authorization part. So for this, we have to go to our directory service again, right? Because this one is our identity repository. Now we are going to add some groups. As you can see here, we have some groups predefined, but we will not use them for this. So let's add some groups. For example, this one. Yet another. Dev demo read only. So now we have our groups within our directory service. Let's add some users to these groups. So Ronald. What you can do, you can even do some group hierarchies, like you would like to have it within your company, but it's somehow out of the scope of this demonstration. So now if we go back to Keycloak and to our users, and especially at first into the groups, we can see here there are no groups yet. So we have to sync the groups. For this, we have to go to mappers. This one is added by me. So you have to configure how to map your groups, and I specified a filter so only to use the ÖBB groups. So think groups, these groups are imported, and if you go to users and view, for example, my user, we can see it's already mapped. So my user had the corresponding group, and Ronald's user had the same too from directory service applied. So now we have to configure it within Kubernetes somehow, right? So let's go to Kubernetes. So at first I will delete the identity token. So the refresh token would fetch me the new one. So at first, if I do the same operation for getting something, I'm still not permitted because we didn't specify any configuration yet, right? So we can now provide the cluster role binding with the related group and only namespaced one, for example, like me to be able to get some or to read some object within the demo namespace. So for this, I have to switch to the administrative user because I need some administrative access to configure this. So apply demo read only. And the cluster admin. So if we look into the cluster role bindings, we can see it's applied. So the other one is applied too. Just trust me. So let's switch back to the demo user. And if you can, as you can see here, I'm able to view some objects to get more information which operations are supported or are permitted for my user. I can use some kubectl plugins, for example. This one is Access Matrix, where I have some output like on which objects, which operations are permitted. So you can see here I'm not able to retrieve any secrets because I have only few permissions on restricted objects, which are not security relevant. So like, I don't know, like service, for example, is not as security relevant as secrets to a database, but they can a few limit ranges or resource quotas. For example, if I need somehow to look up how many resources are still available, for example, to use. If I have any permission within another namespace like kubesystem, you will notice that I do not have any permissions there. So let's check Ronald's user. For this, I have to delete the identity token first because it will be refreshed for my user. Maybe it's already in the new kuplogin version supported that you can use a different user to replace it, but I don't know. Yeah, so kube login. So, and if we look up the permissions of Ronald, because we mapped him to the cluster administrator group, you can see here he is able to do any operation. Like if he would have the administrator account for the certificate and private key for the global admin. Now I will switch to another cluster like prod, because usually you are not doing all the work manually by configuring every cluster by your own. And we use some patterns here. So these patterns allows us to automate the whole parts we have seen here right now. So I'm on the production system right now, production system. So let's log in as Ronald again. So, and we should get the same result. So, yeah. And if I switch back to my user, which is not configured, for example, to do anything on the production system because there's no group, so on. So. If I do the same operation I'm allowed on the demo, I'm not permitted on production system. So these configurations are applied by convention. So if you set up or if you create a new namespace, the role bindings and so on are automatically added within your Kubernetes cluster. But it's somehow out of our presentation scope. Yeah, that's it. So if we go back to the presentation, that's all from our part. Thank you a lot. If you have any questions, just ask. If you have some, I don't know, bigger questions, we can move to our info point and discuss it later. And yeah, any information is available on speaker deck in the presentation or on GitHub if you like to set up the same demonstration.
Thank you very much, Dimitrij and Ronald. We have questions on Slido, which are voted as well, so I'm going to ask these. Since Core OS is no more, what do you think about Rancher OS and Rancher for Kubernetes management?
It depends, because we are using, yeah, it's just like, I don't know, some companies have some contract restrictions to use, for example, Red Hat. So I would just go with OpenShift if I have Red Hat already in my house. And if I get all the support and so on. We are using plain Kubernetes, and we are forced by company policies to use the CNCF stack. So we could use Rancher, but we are going the plain solution because we need some freedom to customize a lot of things. Like as we set up our clusters, it's not as easy to reconfigure it within Rancher maybe. But yeah, Rancher adds just a top level or layer where you can simply apply to existing infrastructure, to existing clusters. We are not using it yet, maybe later on, I don't know. But it's quite a nice solution and an easy way to start on.
Mm-hmm. A question that's tightly related, why not just use OpenShift and call it a day?
because we are not allowed to use OpenShift, and we are using Kubernetes because we do not have Red Hat in our house, or they don't have Red Hat in their house. They have some better solutions, maybe. I don't know how to call them. Yeah. And it depends. OpenShift is not a silver bullet for everything. So it does not mean if you have OpenShift, you have done everything out of the box. So sure, you have OpenID Connect and so on supported there, but you have still to configure it and so on.
A fun question.
Does the ÖBB use Ruby on Rails? And
it might be, but I don't know every project in the company. In my scope, no.
Okay.
But definitely
Somewhere.
You mentioned in the beginning that you're doing all this at a very, very big scale. So a question here was, what is ÖBB doing with so many clusters? What is running in there? Can you give us a couple of examples?
One thing is a data science platform, for example. Another thing is something used by sub-company Rail Cargo. It's a project where you allow customers to track their shipments, where they are, how the load is, the timing, do the containers arrive in time, and so on. I think you a little bit more into it, Dimi. Yeah?
So this one is running completely in Kubernetes, and the projects, there are multiple projects which are somehow separated, because one part of Rail Cargo is running between Kubernetes and it's the Rail Cargo part, but Rail Cargo uses some data clusters and so on to store the data and so on, which is not within the cargo cluster, because the cargo cluster is fully stateless. So it can scale to infinity. If you go to Azure, for example, as many nodes or as many data centers Azure have, so there you can scale to. Yeah, so it depends, because there are different use cases for using Kubernetes. And if you are somehow successful, it's somewhere a reason to maybe do even more Kubernetes clusters. So
another thing would be our websites, for example. ÖBB is currently not, but will in the near future already also run under Kubernetes.
Is the backend of the new ticket app running in Kubernetes as well?
Ticket shop.
The ticket shop, yeah.
It's sure. It's a completely separated system on Mars. So you can see it like that because it's untouchable from our side.
Okay.
Are there tutorials, books, certifications you guys would recommend to get into Kubernetes?
Sure, just follow the original documentation and tutorial on Kubernetes docs. I think it's the most recent and most easiest way to start on, because everything is documented there. If you have some questions, just ask on GitHub, or there are different channels, maybe on Slack. And certifications, we are all of our guys within my company, we are all certified Kubernetes administrators. I don't know which certification is relevant, because this one is directly from the CNCF or Linux Foundation, so you need this one to get CAD CSP and so on. Yeah, OpenShift certification from Red Hat. The Red Hat certifications are quite useful, but they are hard as hell. Yeah.
Maybe one final question. Maybe that wasn't clarified well enough in the beginning. How is ÖBB related to WhizUs? So how are the two companies related to each other?
The company is supporting us in lots of day-to-day Kubernetes questions. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much again for the talk.
Yeah.